breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast with Lizzie Green and Joe Crowley. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Justice Matters Pod for clips. Enjoy the episode.
This episode contains descriptions of violence against children. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello, Joe.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I am well. Now, you've been talking to me about this topic for a couple of weeks now. You've done a lot of work on it and are very invested in it. So I'm looking forward to deep diving.
Yes, well, and I should note that this was requested by one of our reviewers.
Okay, good.
The case, but also it has been in the media or back in the consciousness of the justice system broadly since last year. So renewed interest in this case. So this is the case of Robert Farquharson.
Yes.
And I'm sure that there would be some listeners who would recall Robert Farquharson's case.
Is it a Victorian case or
yes,
Victorian case? Yep. Okay.
He was convicted
Yep.
of killing his three sons.
Yeah.
The circumstances were that he drove the car he and his three sons were in into a dam,
Yes.
and he got out and the children didn't and obviously died.
Yeah.
So he is serving a period of no less than 33 years in prison for those murders.
Was it 3 times a life sentence or something, or?
Well, he got life imprisonment with earliest
Parole, 33 years.
33 years.
Okay. And you said it's been in the media recently. Why has it been in the media recently?
Well, because Farquharson had 2 jury trials, 2 appeals to the Court of Appeal, and 1 application to the High Court. And so 24 jurors, 11 judges all agreed with the conviction on the murder charges.
Yeah. Well, but before Galileo, all scientists believe that the Earth, the sun rotated around the Earth. So, I don't think numbers necessarily help, but yeah.
But he has a new lawyer who apparently first came across Farquharson's case when he was at law school and was reading about this, who believes that there has been a miscarriage of justice and that Farquharson is innocent.
And they've got new scientific evidence, haven't they?
Well, they're saying they have new scientific evidence.
Oh, okay.
So we'll talk about that. But also we now have, I think Victoria had the ability from 2019 and Queensland has a similar ability now to lodge an application for a subsequent or second appeal. And that's the framework that they are planning to pursue.
Okay. When did this murder originally occur? When does this? Because I remember it in the paper at the time.
It happened on Father's Day, 2005.
Okay, so very old.
Yeah, it is old.
And they haven't made the application yet, but he's already done he's done 20 years in prison already. Yeah.
Well, so there is a detailed podcast on this.
Okay.
Yes, Trial by Water. They refer to it as he's, about halfway through his sentence. So he was after the first conviction and appeal, then we had the second trial and conviction.
And he was out of jail between the two.
I'm not sure about that, but definitely he didn't get sentenced until 2010.
Yeah, but they would have backdated it because he would have been in custody the whole time.
Yes, well, I didn't look at the dates.
I think their maths is wrong.
His,
just off the top of my head.
I think it's more than half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
25 minus 5 is 20.
For eligibility.
Minus 20 is
yes.
For eligibility. All right. Okay. So, but also Helen Garner's written a book on this.
Yes, one of the podcast references we have made before.
So Joe Cinque's Consolation, her book, we did a show on that recently, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Yeah. So Helen Garner sat through every court hearing.
Yep.
And she wrote a book at the end of it. And she was not definitively for or against Farquharson's guilt or innocence.
Yes.
I haven't read the book, but she also...
What was the name of the book? You can't remember. Sorry.
So there are two books because there's another journalist called Megan Norris who also wrote a book. So I've probably got in my notes the titles of these books. We'll come back to it. Did Megan Norris sit
through all of it?
See, I mean, she did.
So you say, 24 jurors all think he's guilty. It's like, well, Helen Garner sat in the back of the court. She listened to it all. She wasn't convinced.
Well, I'm not saying for sure whether she thought he was guilty or not. But my point is Helen Garner's book was quite it caused a bit of a stir because it did show sympathy with Farquharson throughout the book, because, and I guess this is where we'll come back to, but we think about someone who's alleging a miscarriage of justice, and we saw it happen with Kathleen Folbig, who served 20 years for the murder of her 4 children and has now been exonerated.
Yes.
And if Farquharson has been the victim of a miscarriage of justice, then not only has he had to suffer these years of prison and being publicly convicted, but underlying all of it is the loss of his children, so...
I mean, like Lindy Chamberlain, losing her poor baby Azaria and then being prosecuted for it.
That's right. And so both Lindy Chamberlain's case and Kathleen Folbig's case are referenced in the context of Farquharson's matter because they all have to do with children who have been killed and public reaction and media perception and, this suggestion that the police want to get justice for that little baby.
Yeah.
And if there's a question, is it an accident or is it a crime?
Yeah.
They're looking apparently to make it a crime so that there's justice, So this is the narrative that seems to be emerging.
Yeah.
And so we know without doubt that there are wrong convictions.
Yes.
But I guess after everything I've read and listened to in relation to Farquharson, I'm not convinced this is one of those.
Okay, interesting.
So we'll see.
The stats from the United States are that 5% of all convictions are wrong. So we don't keep stats in Australia because then you don't, you don't have something to point to. So yeah, I mean, 5% is
substantial.
Well, I suppose 90. The system then is 95%, right? I mean, that's pretty good.
Okay, but how about how many? I mean, what I want to know about those statistics is, are they looking at all convictions, even those who've pleaded guilty? Because then,
I think they are, because this came from the Innocence Project, and they have had some people whose convictions were overturned in circumstances where they pleaded guilty.
But that's right. So if you think about of that 95% that are not wrongful, how many of them pleaded guilty?
Yeah.
So if we're looking at ones who went to trial and were convicted, I think that's also...
Skew the stats.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say is if people are interested in media influence on the law, they should look at our episodes 2 and 3, shouldn't they? Because we did a double header on that.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about Folbig, I think. We talked a lot about Lindy Chamberlain.
I know. I do still want to talk about Folbig. It's a tough one, though.
Yeah.
But yes, lots about Lindy Chamberlain, and I will be talking about her a little bit in the context of Farquharson.
Yep.
So let me
jump in.
Let me tell you about it, and then we'll see what you think.
Okay.
I can predict what you will think, but that's okay. Okay. That's okay. All right. So Farquharson had been in a relationship with a woman called Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
She, after all of this, went back to her maiden name, so people probably know her as Cindy Gambino.
Got it.
And they had 3 boys. So at the time of their deaths, the 3 boys, we had Jay, who was nearly 11, Tyler, who was 7, and Bailey, who was 2. And that was their 3 children. They lived in a town called Winchelsea in Victoria, which I think is a little town.
Sure.
Yeah. So the relationship did break down, and by most accounts or all accounts, it was Cindy who instigated the end of that relationship. She was done. And so Farquharson moved out of the house and Cindy stayed in the house. They'd been building the house together. She did move on. She had a new partner, and I think he was even living in that house by the time of the tragedy.
Yeah.
And he had his own children as well. So Cindy was happy. The split was, I guess, reasonably amicable. They didn't have to go to court for settlements. She was more than happy for him to have access to the children. He did still have them regularly and spend time with them.
Mm-hmm.
But there is also definitely a narrative or a version that says that Farquharson was not happy. He'd had to move back in with his dad. He complained to people that Cindy got the house and Cindy got the good car.
Okay.
He didn't like the car he got left with.
And that's crucial, isn't it, to some of the evidence that comes out later?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay.
But people have, more than one person have described him as a whiner, a whinger.
He's a whinger, okay.
And I think he had suffered from depression at points in his life, So Cindy was definitely in a good place. Farquharson maybe not so much.
No,
but
I mean, this is a tale as old as time.
Correct.
The woman decides to leave. The man doesn't realise there's problems in the relationship. The woman leaves. She's sort of got ideas, gets on with her life. The bloke who, comes out of nowhere for them, they are sort of emotionally shell-shocked and take a while to sort of get themselves on their feet and get going again.
I don't know why you have to say woman. Like, that could happen in any relationship.
Sure,
but it could be the man who does that.
That's right, but the statistics are that women more often in relationships than the men do.
What?
Yeah.
Where are those statistics from? What are you quoting? Where's your proof?
Okay.
Don't throw those statistics at me. Anyway, so the 4th of September 2005 was Father's Day.
Yeah.
Farquharson had been, I think, at work in the morning, so he was going to have the boys in the afternoon.
Yep.
And so Cindy drove them over to him. She stayed while they opened their Father's Day presents, and then she left, and she was going to get the boys back from Farquharson at about 7:30 that night. It was the first Father's Day since they split up, so it was, an important day. And they went and did a couple of things with Farquharson. I think they drove to Geelong. They saw a mate of his. They saw Farquharson's sister.
Yeah.
They went to Kmart.
Yeah.
They got KFC.
Beautiful.
Which apparently they called Kentucky, which I've never heard of, but maybe that's a Victorian thing.
Oh, okay.
I just always
it is
KFC.
Kentucky.
It is Kentucky Fried Chicken, but anyway.
Okay.
And then on the drive home, the car ended up in a dam off the Prince's Highway, where it sank with the boys inside.
Yes.
So obviously the only people present were Farquharson and the boys at the time of that occurring. So Farquharson's story was that he blacked out.
Yes.
And he came to and they were in water. Now, he said that Jay, the 10-year-old who was in the front seat, had opened the passenger door and he quickly reached across and pulled it shut. And then he got out his door thinking he'd go around and get the boys out.
Okay, interesting.
But he said that he hopped out and the water was a lot deeper than he'd expected. He thought maybe they were in a ditch or, shallow water. And he said the car just sank.
Yeah.
And so the boys were gone.
Yeah.
And so he runs, gets out of the water, swims across, gets out of the water, runs back up to the Prince's Highway, and he flags down a car. And it was driven by these two guys, Shane Atkinson and his passenger, Tony McClelland.
Yeah.
And they said, and Farquharson never disputed this, they said that they were like, mate, are you all right? They thought he was trying to commit suicide because he'd looked like he was running onto the road.
Right.
So they'd pulled over and they hopped out and met him on the road. And they're like, mate, are you okay? What's going on? And he said, oh, I've killed my kids. I fucking killed my kids. You've got to take me to my ex. I've got to tell her. And they're like, what are you talking about? What have you done? What's happened? And he said, the kids are dead. They're in the car. And they looked at the dam. They couldn't see the car. And they're like, well, should we go in and search for it? He goes, no, I've got to go. Take me to my ex. I've got to tell her the kids are dead.
Yeah.
And they're like, have you called for help? And he's like, my phone doesn't work. Like, he was all wet.
Yeah.
His phone was wet. And they're like, you can use our phone. He's like, no, just take me. It was really persistent. Just take me to tell Cindy.
Yeah.
And so they did. They put him in the car and they drove to Cindy's house, and he knocks on Cindy's door and he says, the boys are dead. I've killed the boys. And, she obviously freaks out, and she and her new partner, Steve, they all go back to the dam, and they get back to where he said the car sank, and the new partner immediately goes into the dam and is looking for the car, and Cindy calls 000, and I've listened to the 000 call, and Joe, it is heartbreaking.
It would be, absolutely.
Like it is literally a mother's heart breaking on the phone, you know? And so then other people are coming, like, you know, people come quite quickly. There's just civilians, then there's the fire authority, then the police. And all of this time, Farquharson has not gone back into the water. Yeah. He's not helping to look for the car. Yeah. He's a bit preoccupied with whether people can give him cigarettes to smoke. And he never once called, you know, it wasn't him who called for help.
No, okay.
The police obviously, he gets taken to hospital, and the police speak to him for the first time in hospital to find out, you know, what happened. And I've heard some of that interview as well.
Is that recorded?
Yeah, it's recorded.
Okay.
And during the course of that first interview, not once does he ask, did you find the car? Have you found my kids? He does ask, what do you reckon is going to happen to me?
Sure, well, he's talking to the police.
He asked that a couple of times, but he was being spoken to not necessarily as a suspect at that point.
I think if police are standing in front of you, you know you might be in trouble.
I think anytime there's a accident like that, you'd have to talk to police, though.
Yeah, if you drive your car into a dam, absolutely. But
he's not in a station. He's in the hospital.
You've got a uniformed police officer standing in front of you.
All right. And then the police say to him, they said, how do you feel about what's happened? Okay. Stupid question.
Why would you ask that?
Stupid question. I agree. But his response was, and I heard his response, pretty shithouse.
Okay. I've been holding my tongue.
Holding back.
You said you'd guess what I was going to say. What am I going to say?
That people don't react.
We can't judge how people would react in this. And what's the classic case?
Lindy Chamberlain. I know.
Okay. So but we don't know how we would react.
Can we draw a distinction though?
Sure.
So every time I've heard a reference to Lindy Chamberlain in the context of Farquharson's reaction, her reaction upon the baby being taken was hysterical and screaming and panicked, and the criticism of her reaction was more so during the trial when she looked very stoic and probably what we would call resting bitch face, okay, but I think that's different to judge someone's reaction in the aftermath of something horrific where you've just been in a car with your 3 children, the car's gone, and you're asking for a smoke, you're not calling 000, you're saying they're already dead, you don't know that,
well, it wouldn't be hard to guess. Your car is underwater in the lake.
You'd be hot.
He opened the door of his car. It's not going to be like there's an air bubble in the car,
I challenge you to find, honestly, I would love to know how many people, if the car with their children goes down, would not even dive down.
Okay, well, I mean, Teddy Kennedy didn't do it in the Chappaquiddick, accident.
I don't know that one.
Okay, so John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Edward Kennedy, Teddy, his brothers, two older brothers have been assassinated. He's now the great hope of the Democratic Party in the United States. And he's got this glittering political career ahead of him. He drives off a bridge at night with his girlfriend in the car. It lands in the water. He gets out of the car, swims to shore. She drowns. And it happened, I don't know whether the bridge was called Chappaquiddick or whatever, but that's what it's known as. And that really, they say, destroyed his ability to ever become the American president, because there was real question marks over, well, why didn't you go and save her? Why didn't you make an attempt to it?
Did he give a reason? Her? Did he say he thought she'd gotten out, or?
I've never made a study of it. I don't recall ever hearing his version of what happened. And exactly what happened straight afterwards is all very, he was sort of rushed away by the family, and they didn't show. It's said they didn't show much remorse for the poor girl who just drowned.
I can understand that would have had a negative impact.
Sure. Well, he was never charged. Maybe for traffic infringement. But he was never charged with murder or anything like that.
I do also see a difference between, an adult person who you've just gotten out of a car. There's another adult person in the car who you maybe assume was able to also get out. We're talking about a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old.
Sure.
I do I draw a tiny difference there.
Well, his version is that he tried to help me. He opened the door. It was deep. He was going to go around and get the kids out of the car. Then the car sank because it was in deeper water than he expected. Well, he said he tried.
Yeah. Okay.
And again, this is a moment of sheer panic. You don't always act entirely sensibly.
I know. It just seems like such a departure from right or wrong how you would expect.
See, that's so dangerous to say things like that.
But
how do we know how people would react?
Because how many times do we hear these stories of these parents who show superhuman strength?
Sure.
And
that's some people how they react. That's not everyone.
No, but
the whole reason we talk about those is because they sound like they're unusual.
All right, so you're going to love this one as well. So one of the police involved.
Oh, here we go.
Who was at that time with the Major Collision Investigation Unit. Yeah.
He was an expert. I'm doing air quotes for those watching.
Well, this isn't expert evidence yet. We'll get to that.
Go. Yep.
But this was, he was the one who interviewed Farquharson after, one of those first interviews.
Right. Yeah, he had a gut feeling.
And at the time, he made a list of more than 10 reasons why it would have been, or what made him think it would have been a deliberate act.
Oh, for God's sake.
And could only think of one reason.
What a waste of time. And P.S. That's totally inadmissible. I hope that never went before the jury.
It didn't.
Good.
It didn't. But his one reason for why it could have been an accident is because he said, who could be that evil? No one could be that evil.
Oh, for God's sake.
I'm raising this because in a similar way with Lindy Chamberlain, the prosecution couldn't put forward one single motive why she might have wanted to kill her baby, so it's this idea of trying to understand, what had happened and the way that people interpret
But
things.
sorry, they did put forward a motive in Farquharson's case, didn't they? They said he wanted to kill the kids as revenge against the mother.
They did. I'm just saying these are the initial conclusions that people draw, and it's based on right or wrong.
Sorry, it's based on what? Their subjective opinion, which is really
right.
pretty
It wasn't
irrelevant.
put in as evidence. That's
no,
fine.
Thank God.
What evidence did they have to try him for these murders? Okay.
Some scientific, I'm doing air quotes again for those not watching on YouTube. Scientific evidence.
So bear with me because there's what we call like maybe 6 different strands. It's been referred to as the strands of the rope case. Like you've got circumstantial evidence.
Strands of the rope was talked about in the High Court case in Lindy Chamberlain. It's a pretty common way to a visual metaphor for how circumstantial cases work. So, there's nothing odd about that. But I thought, in an early conversation we had about this case, these 6 strands were thought up by journalists, weren't they, or something?
Well, they definitely had characterised it as a circumstantial case.
Sure. Yeah. But it's not, this is some judgments in courts of appeal will go, they'll summarise a case and they'll go, there's really 6 things that convict him and they list them. But that's not where these 6 come from. It came from a book or something?
This was from the other podcast.
Oh, the other podcast. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so they've summarised the case. So let's hear what those
I've read the judgments.
Okay.
I've read the judgments.
Okay.
Well, I definitely read the judgment of the second Court of Appeal judgment and his sentencing remarks.
Yes.
So I'm taking my information from there.
Good.
Okay, so he maintained from the beginning when he said that he'd blacked out. Sorry, there was one other thing. He did say at first to the 2 people who he flagged down that maybe a wheel bearing had gone in the car.
Got it.
He also mentioned to them he'd had a coughing fit.
Got it.
So his argument by trial was that he'd had a coughing fit and blacked out. And this is an actual medical phenomena. It's called cough syncope.
Wow.
Yes.
That's a scientific name, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's been around since like 1800 and something.
Wow. Okay.
Cases of it. But it is, the evidence was that it was quite rare.
Right.
Usually reserved or seen in like middle-aged men who had respiratory issues, maybe were smokers,
sure,
that sort of thing.
So he was a middle-aged man but wasn't a smoker or
I think he was in his 30s.
Okay.
Yeah. The evidence was that his car had been driving on the Princes Highway. It diverged to the left, diverged to the right, left the bitumen, crossed the shoulder of the highway, descended an embankment covered with rough grass, broke through a fence, crossed another grassed area, struck the foliage of a tree, and then entered the dam, floating for about 28 meters before sinking down to the depth of the dam, which was like 7.
Well, when you say floating, how do they know it wasn't aquaplaning? I mean,
well,
it was 28 meters
into
it
was 28 meters
into
in.
Okay.
And so clearly the central question was, did he deliberately drive into the dam and leave the boys?
Yeah.
Or did he fall unconscious, wake up, and couldn't save them?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So the prosecution relied on a number of pieces of evidence, and this is from the Court of Appeal judgment.
Got it.
His anger towards Cindy because of the marriage breakdown, her new relationship, the fact she was living in the house and had kept the family car.
What's the evidence of that?
Can we just?
I mean, they literally were together that day.
We will
having
come
a Father's
back
Day thing.
To
okay.
Yes. The improbability of the event having occurred accidentally in the way described by the applicant.
Okay.
His strange behaviour after the drowning of his children.
For God's sake, all right. Yep.
The expert evidence, which was said to show the extreme unlikelihood of his having suffered cough syncope.
Yep.
The evidence of a police accident reconstruction expert, Senior Constable Urquhart,
right.
that the vehicle appeared to have been consciously steered into the dam.
Okay.
You are very dismissive. You haven't heard any of it.
I would have absolutely objected to that evidence.
The evidence of one of his mates, a fellow called, ex-mates, Greg King, referred to as the fish and chip shop conversation, which took place in the June or July before Father's Day in September, where he had said he wanted to get back at Cindy.
Yeah.
And indicated the boys. We'll come back to that. A witness who came forward only in the second trial, who said she was driving behind Farquharson right before the incident, which was apparently quite persuasive. That is a problematic piece of evidence.
I think there's a number of problematic pieces of evidence here, yep.
The changes in the account given by Farquharson after the event, so the wheel bearing, the coughing, what happened in the car, did a door get opened by the kid first, Then, interestingly, that when the car was discovered, the lights were switched off, the ignition was off.
So this occurred at night, did it?
Yeah, 7:30ish.
Okay.
Just before 7.
And in September, so it's going to be cold.
Yeah, so the lights were off, the heating was off, the ignition was off, and the kids weren't wearing seatbelts. And one of them's only 2, remember?
Sure, maybe they'll try and get out of the car.
Maybe.
Because it was sinking.
Maybe they were. The fact he failed to take any steps to assist the children.
Oh, for God's sake.
And his general demeanour and behaviour.
Oh, for God's sake.
So this is all of the evidence that they were bringing.
Yep.
All right. So let's think about the expert evidence. We'll get straight into that.
Okay.
So there were 2 different types of expert evidence. Firstly, the cough syncope evidence, and then the accident reconstruction and the sinking of the car.
Got it.
Okay. So medical and technical,
yes.
I suppose. So the Crown expert was a fellow called Dr. Norton. He was head of general respiratory and sleep medicine at the Alfred Hospital.
Okay.
And he said, yes, it's a legitimate medical issue, but in his opinion, it was very unlikely that Farquharson had suffered an episode of that.
And why did he say that?
Well, he said it was rare, occurring mostly in middle-aged men with an obstructive airway disease.
Got it.
Another neurologist, Dr. King, said that it can definitely cause a loss of consciousness, that, severe coughing.
Yeah.
He said that about 80% of persons who suffer from cough syncope also had chronic lung disease. So the medical information from the Crown was that, yes, it occurs. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
But for him to have suffered that would be very rare.
Yes. Well, 20%.
Unlikely.
Was 80% of people had the respiratory problems, so 20% of people didn't.
Yeah. But also the age factor, I think, as well.
Sure.
Yeah. The defence called their own expert witness, Dr. Steinfort, and he's still invested in the case.
Got it.
He said the description of the episode suffered by Farquharson was a classic description of cough syncope.
Okay.
Farquharson did give evidence at trial. He'd never suffered such an episode prior to Father's Day.
Sorry, which trial, the first or the second, or both?
The second trial. This is all from the Court of Appeal's judgment of the second trial.
Okay.
And Steinford said that wasn't consistent with what Farquharson had told him when he'd consulted with him.
Right.
And Farquharson then was cross-examined. Well, had you ever had one before or not? And he couldn't give a definitive answer.
Got it.
So that was problematic.
Okay, yep.
So that was the cough syncope evidence.
Yeah.
Okay. Then they called Sergeant Urquhart about the accident reconstruction.
Yeah.
And he provided evidence in relation to the course the car would have had to take to get from the road into the dam.
Sure. Presumably they knew the course pretty well because it's you can see the tracks through the long grass and through the fence.
Well, I think it was quite long grass. I read something that said they didn't go into as much detail in the second trial because there was a lot of evidence about grass and this sort of thing at the first trial. Like I think it was a bit of a forward drive track, like I think by the time he'd gone down off the highway into the dam, it wasn't like on a track.
No, sure, it was through long grass. But if you drive across long grass, you flatten the grass.
I know, but there were so many vehicles that came that night. And so one young police officer who was one of the first at the scene did in fact have the presence of mind to...
So stop driving on that.
Well, stop driving, but also put little markers at what he thought were the tyre tracks into the dam to give them that trajectory. Yes. But it was very complicated. But so he said, in his opinion, based on the examination of the scene and the car, that the car was under control prior to entering the dam, that there had been 3 steering inputs or movements.
Okay. How did he determine that?
And he provided a reenactment of the car's path. And so that was based on having to go, from driving straight to being in the dam, like to get there. And there was
doesn't sound like it's rocket science. You just turn the wheel.
No, there were obstacles and
a fence,
trees
apparently.
And fences and that sort of thing. So to not be stopped by one of those was this evidence that you had to sort of steer to get through.
You had to weave your way around
a little bit
trees, obviously not fences, since he went straight through that.
So there obviously were objections to that evidence, but despite objections, all of that evidence was admitted, deemed admissible, expert. And the last type of scientific evidence related to the speed at which the car would have sunk in the dam. So the Crown provided, again, evidence of a reenactment, testing essentially whether it was possible that Jay had opened the passenger door and he'd reached across and pulled it, then whether he had opened his door and hopped out, how quickly it would have sunk. And so, yes, it was possible to do that. If someone opened the passenger door, you can reach across and close it. If he opens his door, the car will sink quickly. It does sink quickly.
Yeah.
Part of the problem, I think, was they also did like a video of a car just sinking. And so that took quite a long time, but it didn't have the door opening, so it wasn't really useful.
Sure. I hope they didn't show that to the jury?
They did.
Oh, for God's sake. Who is it? Why is the defence not objecting? This is just...
Well, they did. They did object, but these were expert witnesses. We'll come back to that.
Surprise, surprise. A police officer who is an expert in traffic gives evidence that supports the prosecution case. Who would have thought?
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable.
That's assuming that they're not telling truthful evidence.
Well, no, wrong. I'm not suggesting they're lying, but people assume that experts approach questions using the scientific method, which means that they don't know that the answer they're going to get. Yes. They're inquiring into it and they're happy to let the evidence take them one way or the other. My experience is that many experts, scientists or police experts or whatever, don't actually approach it like that. They approach it with the answer in mind.
Yeah.
And so that they are automatically viewing the evidence in a biased way. They've got a preconceived notion, which they may be completely unaware of, that they've got a preconceived notion.
Yes.
But they're then more likely to focus on or to emphasize evidence that supports their preconceived notion as opposed to evidence that doesn't.
Yes. I agree that happens. All right. But so the defence alleged that the car sank pretty much immediately.
Yeah.
There 1 second, gone the next.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was the expert evidence.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have Greg King's evidence.
Yeah.
So he and Farquharson had been friends for a really long time, and they would catch up. They played footy together, I think. And as I said, little town. So in like the June or July before Father's Day, seemed to be that everyone was having fish and chips that night.
Right.
So Greg King's outside the fish and chip shop. Farquharson was inside with his boys. And he went out to talk to Greg King, like through the car window, I think it was.
Right.
And Greg King said he was having a bit of a whinge. Cindy happened to arrive to also get fish and chips.
Right.
And he said...
Farquharson
said, I've got the shit car. I'm gonna get back at her. I'm gonna take away the thing she most loves.
Yeah.
And King said to him, well, you wouldn't even dream about that. And he goes, oh, speaking of dreams, I had this dream about the kids in the dam.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So within, I think, 3 days after the boys had died, King went and spoke to the police and he told them about this conversation. He said he had gone home and told his wife about it because it did worry him. But then at the same time, Farquharson was such a whinger, wasn't really paying attention.
Had no history of violence.
No history of violence, that's right.
And obviously this guy wasn't concerned enough to go and tell Cindy.
No, none of that. And so...
Just happened to remember it
the police
6 months later.
Obviously, 3 months. The police obviously were interested in that conversation. And so what they did was they
Because they don't have a great case. Yeah, so
they asked him, King, if he would wear a wire and go and talk to Farquharson about the conversation.
Yes.
And so he did. He did that on 2 occasions. Now, not once did Farquharson say that conversation didn't happen, but he said, oh, no, I was talking about the car. I was talking about taking away the car.
Yeah.
And King said, but you kind of nodded your head at the kids. No, don't say that. Like, don't tell anyone that. Tell people I'm a good guy. It wasn't that at all. And King was like, oh, I'm really upset about it. I can't stop thinking about it. He goes, well, you can't tell the police that. And he said, I'm going to go and see a counsellor. And he said, well, don't tell your counsellor that. Like, tell them I'm a good dad, know. That's not what that was about.
Yeah.
And so he agreed the conversation happened, but definitely had a different interpretation of that.
Yeah, that's called hearsay. And that's why generally reporting a conversation that somebody else has had is inadmissible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will put it out there. The exception is where you make a confession or an admission, so you don't actually confess to it, but you say something that, is
against
close.
your interest.
Yeah. So in that sense can be admissible, but it doesn't take away the problematic nature of hearsay evidence. It's not reliable because people, don't necessarily understand what somebody else means when they say something.
Okay, but putting it to him and having him comment on it, that's fine. The jury got to hear that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he
with his
was
version.
cross-examined about it. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
So this bit you're not going to like. I don't really like it myself.
Okay.
But as time went on, Greg remembered more detail.
Yeah, surprise.
Of that conversation at the fish and chip shop.
Yeah.
And so he made a subsequent statement to police that included more detail that said what he meant was the boys. And then in December of 2005, because the police had said to him, if you think of anything else, just write it down and let us know. Greg King wrote a very detailed statement that included a lot more information and said that when he said he was going to take away the thing that meant most to Cindy, King said, what would you do? And Farquharson said, kill them.
Wow.
He went on to say that Farquharson said it would be close by, an accident in a dam, and he would survive, but the boys wouldn't, and it will be on a special day like Father's Day, so everybody would remember.
Okay.
He said he would be the last one to have the boys, and every Father's Day for the rest of her life, Cindy would suffer.
Wow.
So
okay.
Very different.
Very detailed.
And very detailed. That's
and
right.
Does that go before the jury? Oh, gosh.
Yes, it does.
In the first trial as well as the second?
I think so.
So because I've said on this podcast a number of times that when somebody is not convicted at a first trial but are convicted at a retrial, that, in my opinion, is a bit of a red flag. It doesn't definitively mean that it's a miscarriage of justice, but if you look at miscarriage of justice cases, it's surprising to me how often people were not.
But he was convicted in both. He was convicted,
and then he gets off on it.
It was a technicality.
Like, it wasn't.
It was about. Like, Joe, it was something so
like
minor.
Inadmissible evidence going before the jury.
No, not about that. It was something minor. I should have written it down, but it wasn't germane to the expert evidence or any of this stuff. It was a legal technicality. He did say he went home and told his wife about that. She couldn't remember the conversation, so that didn't further anything.
No.
The Court of Appeal found that the extreme version of the statement, as they called that third version, had been correctly admitted, saying the Crown was under no obligation to prove motive. Nevertheless, the version of the Mr. King conversation which the accused accepted was itself very significant because it disclosed at a time relevantly proximate to the death of the children the intensity of his animosity towards Cindy. And in particular...
Well, if you accept the version of events on the third statement, not if you accept the original version that he accepted in the wire conversation.
Well, the words, though, is what the Court of Appeal focused on, that he was going to take away the thing she loved most and that he was going to get back at her.
Yeah, that was the
and
only
he
part
accepted that.
Yeah, sure. But he said he was talking about the car.
The Court of Appeal, no, I think it was the sentencing judge had said, even if we dismiss that third statement, there's still that desire on you to seek revenge.
That's once he had been convicted. Yes, you would have to say that the jury had believed that when he said that he was referring to the boys, so that's relevant on sentence. You know, it's tenuous evidence to work out guilt. Tenuous.
I think, look, I think that third statement is wildly problematic.
I think even the first statement.
I don't, because he accepted that he said it.
Sure, but he said he was talking about the car.
That's fine, and a jury can assess that.
Okay.
But he said it.
Sure. Okay.
And I don't think every person whose children go on to die have said, I'm going to take away what their mother loves most. You know, like it is something that I think is relevant.
Sure. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Jury can get to hear that and he can be cross-examined on it, or he can put it into context or say that's not what I meant. All right. But the third statement is just, I know. That's laying it on with a trowel.
I think that
really
is. Yeah, I think it is problematic. Greg King, I think, suffered some kind of breakdown as a result of all of this. Like I think he did think, why didn't I tell Cindy? Why didn't I tell someone else?
Sure.
So anyway, the other part of the evidence at the second trial was the evidence of a woman called Dawn Waite. And she didn't come forward until after the first trial, after the first appeal. And then she thought, actually, maybe I should tell my story.
Yeah.
And so she said she was driving behind Farquharson, or his car. At the time in question, she could see that she remembered him because he was driving really slow, 60 k's per hour on a 100-kilometre highway. She said he was driving really slowly and he kept looking out to the right. He had louvers on the back of his car. And then she overtook him. And she said as she overtook him, she could see the boys in the car. She could see him. He wasn't coughing. He wasn't red in the face, and he was still looking to the right, and she accelerated past, and then she realised when she was rising up a hill,
his car wasn't there anymore.
The headlights disappeared.
And this, how many years later did she remember this?
4.
And come forward? 4 years later.
4 years later, but she has a very good memory.
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I am sceptical of her evidence because...
And so just this evidence went before a jury.
It did.
I mean, this is unbelievable.
Yep.
Okay.
So... It does turn out that her time is problematic because this accident, this dam, was entered before 7 p.m. and she was in a restaurant some distance away ordering. She had a receipt that said 7:15 p.m. So that timing didn't work. There have been sort of tests done as to whether you could see someone on a moonless night at that time when you're driving past, and you can actually, it is pretty good vision. You could see if they were white or dark skinned, their facial features, where their hands were. So
whether if they were white, whether their face was red or not.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was also admitted. And then
if that's admitted, did the crash investigation expert take into account that the guy was apparently only driving 60 kilometres an hour? I mean, you know, that if you believe her evidence, well, that then feeds into the scientific evidence.
Well, I don't think there was any suggestion he drove into the lake at 100 kilometres per hour. Like if he'd on either version, if he'd passed out,
sure, he's going to
it would have
decelerate.
Naturally slowed.
Well, assuming his foot's not on
but even if he's driving, he's navigating these things, so he's not going to be going at 100.
No, sure. But I mean, they know how far the car gets into the water. I mean, presumably they can work backwards to work out what speed the car's traveling to when it hits the water.
I don't know about that.
No.
All right. Farquharson gave evidence. He did keep giving different versions. Several important details he first revealed in evidence in chief at the second trial relating to when the coughing started, what actually happened when he regained consciousness, what caused the sinking of the car. So his version to the ambulance officers was that Jay opened the door. Other versions were that it was when he opened his door, so he wasn't consistent.
Okay.
What he did after he ended up in the water, did he try to unbuckle the kids' seatbelts? Had he ever dived down at all? He changed his story about these things.
Sure. Okay.
Not consistent.
Okay. Well, lack of consistency can be an indication that a person is lying. It can also be an indication that a person doesn't have a good recollection of events. And if you're in a very stressful situation and you're not taking note of everything that's happening, it's understandable. Also, it could be the fact that he feels terrible that his kids have drowned. And so at some point later on, he does say, yeah, you know what, I did try and get him out, but
That's right. And
because he doesn't want people to think he's just a horrible dad for not trying to save his kids.
Could be. And defense did call their own expert witness to give evidence about the impacts of trauma and the fact that he had suffered the trauma of losing his children.
Absolutely.
And said that there was an innocent explanation for the things where he behaved in a way that objectively you might think is unfeeling or bad.
Yes.
And counsel apparently said, it's not nice, it's sad, it's confused, you're looking at it and you're wanting to turn away from it, but it doesn't mean he's a killer.
Yeah, okay.
But he was convicted.
Yeah.
He appealed. The appeal was dismissed. One of the things that was raised on appeal was there was no option for the jury to convict on manslaughter, so it wasn't all or nothing case.
I was wondering about that. Yeah. On the basis. So manslaughter would be he causes the death, but he doesn't do it intentionally, which would mean it's a sort of a negligent driving case. So they then have to, in some senses you could accept that he had a coughing fit, but he was negligent in that, for example, he knew that he would be prone to those coughing fits, or he should have pulled over when he started the coughing fit, or, and therefore he drove negligently.
Yeah.
And so the Court of Appeal said, no, not relevant.
Well, no, it was prosecution and defense agreed.
Oh my God.
It was either deliberate or an accident.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the defense wants to run the defense of accident, I think, which becomes more problematic when you say, manslaughter's open as well.
We can't have accident to negligent manslaughter.
Yeah.
So that was one of the other things.
Interesting.
Judge Lazary, the sentencing judge, at the start of his reasons for the sentence said, I have been involved in the practice of the law for 38 years, and yet the tragedy of this case almost defies imagination.
Yeah, just so terrible. Young children dying.
So the other thing that I thought was interesting was that Cindy was supportive of Farquharson through the first trial and through the first appeal.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the second trial when she decided, in fact, she blamed him as well.
And why did she change?
I don't know. I don't know definitively. And Cindy has died. She died in 2022 because of a medical episode that occurred on Mother's Day. Would you believe? I know. She had 2 more little children with her new partner. But so they tapped his phone. And so there were conversations between Cindy and Farquharson in that first 4 years after the incident where she was saying to him, don't listen to what other people say. You've done nothing wrong. She gave TV interviews where she said they don't know him. How can they judge him? I want to believe this was an accident.
Yeah. Well, if you think about, this idea that he wants to kill the kids to get back at her. His behaviour on the day that they die, on Father's Day, meeting with her in the morning and then driving out and seeing a mate and then going off to the shops and then having KFC. It's not consistent, I wouldn't have thought, with somebody who's decided he's going to kill his boys by driving into a dam.
I do think that's dangerous, though, because do we need evidence of disordered conduct? I don't think so.
Well, if you're going to have evidence of, all this conversation you had 3 months earlier where he said he's going to kill the kids, well, you've got to put that in the context of the rest of their relationship. It seemed pretty amicable if they're catching up together on Father's Day.
True. And her first statement to police said, among other things, that there had been no violence or coercion in the marriage. It wasn't a case of, I think some of that changed a little bit. But anyway, But so she then gave evidence against him at that second trial.
What would she have to say that's relevant?
So
she painted their relationship out as something different, did she?
So, well, maybe Farquharson's counsel called her because he put to her that she'd maintained that he was a good dad in the past, and she said yes. And then he said to her, your psychiatrist has said that you're in denial and this is affecting your ability to deal with all of this. And she said that's correct. She was in grief. And she also said in court she blamed him for the boys' deaths. And defense counsel said, do you dispute that you hate him? And she said, I hate what he's done to my life. And he said, do you wish that he's convicted of murder? And she said, correct.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds like it's a cross-examination. So it doesn't sound like...
Oh, sorry, yeah.
And if they're calling the psychiatrist as well, her psychiatrist, to explain why she has up to this point supported him and now she's changed the story, that sounds like that's what the prosecution's doing.
Well, and also she said in court that originally she said that he had coughs that would take his breath away in the past, but she said he'd never blacked out from coughing and she wouldn't call his previous coughing fits severe. And so then she was asked if she was changing her evidence on that, and she said, of course I'm changing my evidence.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, look, I think the Cindy aspect is a whole other thing. Megan Norris wrote a book with Cindy's help, and definitely there is suggestions in there that he was a bit stalkerish, that he was a bit obsessed with where she was at times. I think some people would like the narrative to be that there was evidence of coercive control, but I don't think that was ever borne out in all of the years leading up to it. So I don't think that's an angle worth pursuing.
No.
Helen Garner's book, The House of Grief, is what it was called.
Got it.
So she did sympathise with him, but she also said that there was, like she detailed the evidence and the fact that it is a really tough case to know what actually happened. She won't talk about it anymore. She won't be interviewed. She said it was really traumatic.
Gosh, it would be. Well, because it's about children dying, which,
yes.
And I mean, she's a mother, and I mean,
yeah.
So any parent, I think, would have a reason to feel particularly sort of upset by the case. Yeah.
Yeah. So what now? Well, they want to have a second appeal. So they say that there is new evidence and fresh evidence.
Is it new or fresh? Dun, dun, dun.
Well, so the same expert evidence from defence,
yeah.
Chris Steinfurt, says that there's been significant
advances in the study of cough syndrome or whatever it's called.
There's been more
coughitis. What was it?
More known, cough syncope.
Cough syncope.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that there is a case of another fellow called Jeffrey Ferguson, and he was a truck driver, and he was on the phone to his brother one night as he's driving. He has this coughing fit, and then he stops speaking. The brother's going, Jeff, you're there. Next thing, crash.
Oh.
And so he had gone onto the wrong side of the highway. He hit another car and that driver was killed. And he said he came to in the cab of his truck and he hopped out and he could see this person. He was not sure what had happened. Anyway, he got charged.
Yes.
And he got convicted and he spent 2 years in prison.
Yes.
But the evidence that his brother was on the phone and could hear the coughing and then the lack of response gave a lot of credence to the cough syncope argument there.
Yes.
He was the right demographic too, I think. Anyway, so his conviction was overturned and he was released.
Okay.
And so that is something that was in 2015.
Yeah.
So that's something they think is relevant. And apparently heapes of people have come out and said they've suffered cough syncope while they're driving, so they want that looked at.
Well, I mean, again, it's similar to the Chamberlain case in that, years after Zara Chamberlain was taken by the dingo, and people at the time were like, dingoes don't attack children, don't take children. And then there was that poor boy on Fraser Island who's attacked and killed. He was sort of a 7-year-old or something. And so then people, were like, oh, well, maybe Lindy Chamberlain's right. Yeah.
They also want to challenge how fast the car would have sank. There's some expert from Scotland, I think, who's done a lot of testing since 2014. So there's new or
I think it's fresh evidence. I don't want to bore people with the niceties of it all, but if there's fresh evidence is evidence that you couldn't have found with reasonable diligence at the time of trial, and so advances in scientific research You couldn't get that at the time of
Yeah.
trial. So although it's about the same topic, it is actually fresh evidence.
New simulations have been done regarding the steering wheel inputs.
Yeah, there you go.
But the problem with that is that the road where this happened is now vastly different. It was a 2-lane highway. Now it's double lanes.
Right.
There's been huge changes in the topography. So any
Right.
tests done probably aren't as rigorous as if it was the same
Yes.
circumstances.
Yes.
And they also want to look at the fact that there wasn't a psych report done on him ever, and
what's the relevance of that?
Because of the weight that was put on how he reacted.
Yeah, I mean,
sort
what
of
they
thing.
should have done is just not admitted that information in the first place. But sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I heard on something I was listening to that that his lawyer knows it's an uphill battle, that getting this classed as new or fresh evidence would be difficult, but they're going to give it a shot.
I reckon they've got a reasonable argument.
They also talked about the fact that, and this is relevant because we just did an episode on filicide.
Yes.
They also talked about the fact that these kinds of revenge killings by one parent against the other, an expert has said that never happens without a history of, some history of threats or violence or coercive control.
Well, we saw that in some of those cases.
There was definitely that theme, wasn't there?
Yeah.
So that
I'm sorry, another theme, my recollection was in a lot of those filicide cases is the father then kills himself after killing the children.
That does happen. All right. So I guess, we'll watch this space. Queensland has very new subsequent appeal laws, but it's been successful in Victoria before, subsequent appeals, I think maybe 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if Farquharson's case will make it. The only other thing that I read, which I don't know how I feel about this, was that Cindy Gambino's new partner successfully won an application to have Farquharson's right to be buried with his boys stripped.
Oh, okay.
So it just happened last year.
Yeah.
There was an amendment to the Cemeteries and Crematoria Act passed in 2021. So they can force convicted killers and serious criminals to relinquish their right to interment and to protect those directly affected by an indictable offence.
Interesting.
And I think that had quite an impact, apparently, on Farquharson as well. He said the only thing he had really left was that one day he'd be back with the boys. And look, if he killed them, then I don't think he deserves to be buried with them and Cindy. But it's that if, isn't it? You know, the miscarriage of justice question. So I think he probably did it. Are you convinced?
I'm absolutely not convinced at all. I'm not sure he's innocent, but I mean, this is the case they put forwards. Well, as you say, circumstantial, and I would call it a weak circumstantial case. And in fact, I would have objected to, or argued on appeal that it shouldn't have been admitted, a number of pieces of evidence.
It does add up to a lot, though, I think. Anyway, the other discourse about this is scientific evidence and how it should be used and accepted and challenged in courts.
Yes.
And I heard one person from the Australian, I don't know what it was, some scientist saying we should have a panel of independent expert witnesses to assist the court so that we're not picking and choosing our expert evidence depending on which side you're from, and I think there's some merit to that idea.
Certainly. I mean, the criminal law is lagging behind the civil system of, cases, because expert evidence in civil cases is pretty common, and they've got a much more sophisticated way of dealing with it. So they do things called hot tubbing now, where they get the competing experts to sit in the court together and to have a discussion and are asked questions by each side in front of the judge, and so that they can have this sort of, Socratic discussion of the whole thing.
Explore.
So the judge gets a better understanding of where everyone's at. I mean, that's something I've never heard of anybody even suggesting it in a criminal case.
No.
But I mean, or sort of court experts appointed by the court. The problem in criminal law is investigations need to happen quickly, and that police have these people on staff who can do the scientific analysis.
But in the same way, like, some of those defense expert witnesses had given, they'd given evidence in trials for the defense hundreds of times, and so in the same way that a police scientific expert has possible bias. So does a defense.
Sure, absolutely.
So I think,
but I mean,
if we can try and cut that out, like I think look, we know science changes and evolves and is wrong sometimes. So if we can counteract that somehow, or try and limit the possibility for bias or incorrect junk science, as they call it.
Junk science, yeah.
It's, I think,
how many inputs to a steering wheel? That's an interesting scientific
area
of
endeavor. You really took objection to that.
I've never heard of that one before.
Yeah.
Is it a recognised field of expertise? I'm not sure.
Well, Sergeant Urquhart was the expert.
Apparently.
Yes. Anyway, so I just thought it was interesting.
Very interesting. Well researched, as always.
Highlight the problems we potentially face in our system, but it is the only system we have.
That is true. Right. Well, thank you very much for that, Lizzie. It's a bit of a harrowing case, but an interesting one nonetheless.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going. If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.